Well, thank you. Yes, recording is always good because I was able to watch over the last week the recording from last January, so January the 30th, and it's on YouTube. So I was able to go and just see what I spoke about. So it'd be fresh in my mind. So 1 year ago, we gathered on a Saturday morning like this, and the topic was the proclamation of the gospel at and through St. Mary Magdalene Parish. So we're evangelizing our community and the wider neighborhood. And just some highlights from what I spoke about. So first, this was the outline. And we'll be hearing more about this today, I think. I first spoke about the local context of Berkeley being secular. And then I said, why should we evangelize as Christians? Why is this something that we should do? And I looked at some difficulties of doing this. So the context is a difficulty, or not knowing sometimes what is evangelization is sometimes a challenge. And we have to face the negative perception that some people have of the church. So I spoke about that. And also some people view the church as just being fundamentalist. And that's a challenge because they don't want to engage with us. I defined evangelization. Then I looked at how do we share the gospel, and I just shared this circle of, we first start by being evangelized through our relationship with Christ and the church. Then we evangelize in our families, in the parish, the community, and then in the world. And then I highlighted essential characteristics of evangelization. So beauty, joy, and justice. I was very happy I went on the parish website. I think this sums up evangelization. It's that together, so not alone, we share our faith in Jesus Christ. We live the gospel and we care for others. So that's evangelization summed up. So just in a nutshell, the difficulties. So we know that Christianity and the Catholic Church, the perception is often negative, and that stops people from engaging with us. And, one of the aspects of that, of course, is the church's failure to stop child abuse. And so that's been a very large reason. Our keynote speaker might have shed some light on that. Why many people, many Catholics have become nuns, right? They say, I don't want any engagement with faith. And also fundamentalism. So some people, and even Catholics, and I think of the church as Vardnik said in his column this week, a monolith of just unchanging truths throughout time, that nothing changes, and the Catholic Church is exactly as it was 200, 500, 1,000 years ago, and that is not true. We believe in the development of doctrine and teaching, and we try to engage with our world. And then secularism, there are those who think that religion has no place in the public sphere. So in terms of evangelization, it's all about relationship. And I said last year that we want to create a positive relationship with the local community. And part of that is, of course, acknowledging our shortcomings, yes. And then also really explaining the church's teaching so that people don't go away with misconceptions about what we actually believe and teach as a church. And then also we want to participate, and we have done over the last year, in interfaith, ecumenical, and civic activities. So we want to be part of the community. We're not telling people come to us without going to them. So we're part of the community. So after my keynote address at the last conference, we had breakout groups in the afternoon, and each breakout group looked at a specific question and then gave ideas and suggestions of how can we actually use the arts in evangelization, or what can we use social justice. And the Parish Pastoral Council looked at these proposals, gave suggestions, and launched a number of initiatives over the last year. And I'll just briefly go through these. So looking at spiritual life, so a big part of it is explaining Catholic doctrine and just literacy formation. So we have the RCIA process, and that is for people who are curious about what the church teaches. They want to join, but they don't really know, what does it mean to be a Catholic? So it's a process. It starts with inquiry, where people can get an idea of the basics. And if they've decided, okay, I want to become Catholic, they follow through the process. And last year, we had 5 people who became full members of the church at Easter Vigil. There's also confirmation preparation for teens. And so it's good for our young people that we ensure that what they're being taught is relevant to our contemporary context and an accurate representation of what we believe as a church today. And then adult Sunday school. So last Advent, we had 4 sessions of adult Sunday school, all in an effort to, expand our Catholic understanding of doctrine. So eschatology, the last things, we had a session on that. I presented that. And so I was very happy to see that we have another session. This is in the bulletin for this week on Saturday the 26th. Is heaven real? So these are all initiatives aimed at helping people to understand what we teach. There are many movies these days about heaven, many movies about hell. So sometimes, movies shape our understanding. So it's always nice as a church that we can take the opportunity to say, okay, is heaven real? This is what the church teaches. So just note that down. That's a session. And so also during Advent, we had a session on Mary, Mother of the Church, Mother of God, because many people, so we started by saying the Hail Mary prayer, but sometimes they're unsure of what's Mary's role in the church. And when other people say, oh, Catholics worship Mary, they don't have an answer. So adult Sunday school, will be continuing this Lent, is a way of engaging people in the faith. And we want to engage both Catholics and non-Catholics. So we do all of that through our symposium and through other events. And then we have liturgy in the arts, beauty. So I spoke of beauty as a defining characteristic of evangelization. So, for example, I was very happy last November, a Saturday morning, I think I was at the church, and I saw and putting up on the fence, so you can see here, Black Catholic saints, along with a bit of write up on them. And I asked, I said, looks great. It would make me stop from on the road if I was driving or walking. And they said this was an idea that came out of our parish conference last year, to use art and to use stories to attract people. So Black Catholic saints, you're driving along Shattuck and you look and you say, what's that? Or if you're walking, I think you could stop and read a bit more. So that's using the arts and using stories to draw people in. We're also known for music events. I love music, and when I first came to St. Mary Magdalene before the pandemic, I was very happy to discover that there were concerts on a Sunday afternoon. And in our bulletin for this week, I saw that there's a concert next week on the 4th, right? So again, these are all ways of saying, no, the church, we're not against beautiful things. We're not against music. And it's a way of opening up our church to those on the outside. They might not be Christian, but they might love classical music. And the one way to start a conversation, a dialogue with them, might be through them attending an event, coming to a jazz concert or classical concert, and then them saying, oh, this is such a beautiful space, and then we can start a conversation. So that's an initiative that's ongoing, something the parish has always done. But over the last year, in a very deliberate way, using beauty to engage our neighbors. And serving others. So justice, I also spoke about justice as being essential to evangelization. As many of you know, the parish has always had dinners for the poor, food pantry collection. And so that's something that we want to keep. An initiative that even during the pandemic, we didn't stop. I was reading some of the old bulletins, and it was nice to see, okay, when we can't gather together, people got bags to go. So it's important that justice doesn't remain on the periphery of our evangelization, but is an integral part of it. So bringing communion to the housebound, visiting those who are sick, collaborating with the neighborhood in feeding projects, involving those in School of the Madeleine. It's putting justice front and center and saying, well, we are a church that we care about the common good in Berkeley, and we want to continue serving the community. That's why we're here. So we want the local community to know that. Then finally, our faith activities and liturgy. So it's very nice. Again, I found the Stations of the Cross last year very good. And then I was even pleased to know that Father Nick and Deacon, well, he's now Father Jonathan, designed them. And Stations of the Cross were outdoors. So the RCIA led Stations of the Cross one afternoon. And again, this is a way we were outdoors so people can pass, and they probably wonder, what are they doing there? What are these pictures? So that's a way of building our faith. So I encourage you during this Lent to continue that. And then for both Lent and Advent, there were small faith groups where people could meet and share, how is Lent going, a reflection on, Gospels of Lent. And then more recently in December, we had Our Lady of Guadalupe. Our children, they led the 9:30 a.m. liturgy. I thought that was very good. So these are all activities, initiatives of evangelizing ourselves, of saying, well, we're Catholic, but we also not want to forget when looking at others, we want to also evangelize ourselves. And so, of course, putting up or celebrating our Black Catholic saints and our Virgin of Guadalupe. These are all global Catholic activities that we want to participate in. Also under faith activities, These service. We also live stream our masses, as many of you know. I find these very good. So we're on YouTube. We're at 108 subscribers. So I hope after today that this number can at least jump up. So those of you who are on here who are not subscribed to YouTube or on Facebook, you can do so after this. And then last December, we had a taste of just faith in the parish hall, speaking about the racial wealth gap. So these are ways of it forming us in justice, let us know what is happening in Berkeley, in our country, as regards race and the wealth gap. And these are ways of keeping justice before our eyes. And we have Mass outdoors. And then finally, I was very happy to discover that we'll be celebrating 100 years, July. So it's a cause for joy. That was the last aspect of evangelization I spoke about, that whenever we evangelize, we want to appear as joyful people. We're not evangelizing because we're worried about numbers or because we're scared or we're fearful. And that we're joyful people. We want to share that with the community. So I hope that it's on people's radar of the centenary anniversary and that they'll join if they're asked to participate by the committee, they'll join in the planning celebrations, just to know that that's on the radar. It's a community event, so we'll be reaching out to the community. So, and it's nice to celebrate and have them celebrate with us. Just to pause there. So you can see from the conference last year to this year, quite a lot happened. And I'm sure I missed out a few things. So COVID didn't stop us from having many new initiatives. And that's something that's commendable. And we want new ideas. And I think today's talk, we'll have even more initiatives, but looking specifically at some of those challenges of evangelizing those who might say, okay, now I don't want to engage. I'm religious. So we get some ideas. How do we do that? How do we continue to engage them? So that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if you have any questions or any lingering comments, or if any one of the parish council, if there's any important initiative that I forgot, can let us know.
If you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat.
Yes, any questions and comments in the chat? Yeah, so it's nice to be part of St. Mary Magdalene, very dynamic parishes, both our Facebook and website, they show. So yes, if there are any initiatives that you're part of that I missed, it'd be nice to let us know. Oh, commitment to the environment. Yes, so I had that down. And ecology is very close to my heart. And I have here the planned actions are, to consider solar panels. That's something the parish is considering. And then looking at ways of reducing waste and water consumption. So thank you for that. So we're very conscious of our environmental footprint as a parish. And I think even last year we had discussed at the conference having a seminar to speak on how ecology affects us here in Berkeley. But yes, two planned actions are solar panels and wastewater consumption. That's a question here. Does the parish have a welcome and hospitality group that does fellowship with new members? That's a very good question. So, if you're very new, when I say new, as if you're new to the faith, there is the RCIA process. But I don't know if anyone of the parish council would like to answer this, a welcome and hospitality group that does fellowship with new members.
At this time, that's something we are looking to address a little more in the next 6 months or so. Especially right now, we're kind of waiting to see how COVID plays out. We know that it's going to begin to go away. And we do want to address how to bring people in and introduce them, not so much to the faith, because I'm assuming they're already Catholic, but introduce them to the parish. I do a little bit of that when I register new members into the parish, and just trying to give them a little overview of what kinds of things that we have going on.
We also welcome new people at the end of each liturgy.
Yes, and that's always nice to see. I think even last Sunday, someone's asking if new people were added. It was, it's always nice to see. My Father Nick said, any new people? And I think at least 4 people stood up. So that's good. That's positive. And Father Nick putting in the chat our commitment to the help of the Cordnes Creek, which runs on our property. For the Racial Equity Committee, yes, so I'd forgotten about that. That's one of the activities under social justice. And on February the 1st, Laura is telling us we'll be putting up posters and biographies of 12 notable African Americans in the church or on the fence. Right? I like the fence because I thought the Black Catholic saints was very lovely there. Great. So this is very good. And I mean, our takeaway before I introduce our keynote speaker today is that we've done a lot in the last year. So we thank God and we thank all of you. Oh, yes, in the church and on the fence. Oh, yes, thank you, Laura. So a lot has happened in the last year. So it's good to see. It's a very dynamic parish. And we're evangelizing. We're evangelizing. So not even COVID has stopped us. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And thank you. And just a comment here. We also need greeters at all of the masses. Yes, and a way to, when people are introduced, to get more information from them. Kristen is saying, like when we ask them to stand up and we applaud, maybe someone to greet them. So greeters, I guess, at the beginning and end of Mass. So thank you for that. These are all good ideas. And as you can see, all your ideas were taken on board last year in the breakout groups, and the parish council has been working on them. So my time for today is up. So thank you for listening. And what I'll do, I'll introduce our keynote speaker. So he's no stranger to me. He's one of my professors at the Jesuit School of Theology. And so Professor Jerome Baggett, he's a professor of religion and society and the Ignacio Elecure Professor for Jesuit Studies at JST, as we call it. And Professor Baggett is a sociologist. So it's nice to be able to, in our conference, hear from a sociologist who has done lots of research into religion and the religious experience. And he teaches courses at JST, and it introduces students like me. So we're here to study theology, but our society is very important. And like me, I didn't have any background in sociological theory or anything. So Professor Baggett's role is to introduce students like me into method and to help me think through the dynamics of religion and society and culture. All right, so that's his role at JST. So in addition to many scholarly articles, he has published 3 books. You might want to note these. So, because if at the end of his talk you're saying, oh, I'd like to learn more, I think one place to learn more is in his books. So the first one is Habitat for Humanity, Building Private Homes, Building Public Religion. And then the second one, which I've read, it's very good, so I'd recommend it, is Sense of the Faithful, How American Catholics Live Their Faith. And he's also most recently written The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience, Atheism in American Culture. Right? So, Sense of the Faithful, How American Catholics Live Their Faith, and
Skeptic.
The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience, Atheism in American Culture. So he currently teaches courses at JST, as I said, in the area of religion and society, and he's currently doing research on atheism, on atheists in the United States today. So welcome, Jerome, and I'm sure he's very lively and dynamic. So as a professor, I've never been bored in his classes once. I'm not just saying that, you'll discover that it's true for yourself. So I would say just make sure you're sitting comfortably. In a plane, I'd say put on your seat belts. Welcome to Jerome to lead us through how do we, the challenges of secularism and atheism and religion today. So over to you.
Thanks, Joel. I don't know who this Professor Baggett you're talking about is. I thought it was just Jerome, or worse. First of all, thanks everybody for being here. I wish we were all together in person. That's going to happen one of these days, right? And I want to thank Father Glisson for inviting me, and of course Joel and Kat and Alex and Nora and Carolyn, who's right next to me right here in the church office. I had a computer or laptop snafu this morning at the very last minute. And so I'm not doing this from my garage office, because that's a thing now, right? Or my actual office. So I'm in the church office. So I'm gonna have to limit the expletives, which is a big part of my lecturing style, but I'll do my best. Although Caroline, you know, she's got a potty mouth already, I can tell.
She sure does.
So anyway, I'll go on for a little while, and then we can have a question and answer. That's fine, or just discussion. And obviously, if I forget to mention this, obviously, if there are things you want to talk about after my keynote, or after our discussion, or after today, you're always welcome to shoot me an email or call my office and all that kind of stuff. People do it all the time. I'm happy to help to the extent I'm able to. So, you know, we're all friends here, so consider yourself invited. Okay? Well, I'll just get started with my talk called, Well, I'll Be Damned, Considering Atheism and Its Implications in the US Today. You know, it's only been really within the last couple of decades that public expressions of atheism in the United States have become increasingly visible. For example, the number of atheism-related blogs, video blogs, podcasts, online forums is just dizzying, and seems to be growing every day. Camp Quest, a network of secular-themed summer camps for kids, is now in a dozen locations throughout the US. The Secular Student Alliance, the national umbrella organization for campus-based atheist and humanist groups, had fewer than 50 affiliates 10 years ago. Now it's got 300 affiliates in campuses across the country. And even billboards are becoming familiar features in the American landscape. Why believe in God? Just be good for goodness sake, reads one billboard in Denver during the Christmas season. Quit the church. Put women's rights over bishops' wrongs. And that's from outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And of course, in California, atheists make better lovers. After all, nobody is watching. I think I go the opposite way on that one. Sorry about that, Father, but that's a peccadillo on my part, I'm sure. You get the idea. A much discussed indicator that atheism is finding a place within the wider culture is the unexpected popularity of 4 books, all bestsellers at one point or another, that take aim at religion. And these are Sam Harris's The End of Faith, 2005, Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion, Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, and do you have it over there? Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Now, while these books are generally considered to constitute the vanguard of what's been called the new atheism, the terms are actually kind of misleading, because neither atheism in general nor these books' arguments in particular are without precedent. What is new is what I'll call their offensively defensive quality. In other words, rather than trying to understand religion, presumed to be almost wholly nefarious, or try to understand religious people, presumed to be almost uniformly fundamentalist, these books take the offensive and try to explicitly eradicate religion. And then 2, this is interestingly compounded by a kind of defensiveness that would have been unfamiliar to an earlier, more analytical generation of atheists that includes such familiar figures as Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, or of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. Okay. Unlike these old, more secularly triumphant atheists, the new variant displays a call to arms urgency and conviction that rather than being on the ascendancy, secular ways of thinking and living are in fact being assailed by religious publics from seemingly all sides. So why have these books sold so briskly? And more importantly, I think, why did this new cultural space for the public expression of atheism open up when it did? Why now? That's a tough question, but I would suggest a confluence of factors are at play here. One, the first is the emergence of radical Islamic terrorism. The fact that Sam Harris began writing The End of Faith the day after 9/11, 9/12, suggests that this event might have had a comparable anti-religious effect on the broader American citizenry. Two, the secular design movement with its traction within Americans' political school system, public school system, seems to be another factor. Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett are very distinctive, for each having written important books on Darwinian theory, but many Americans no doubt share their fed up with faith reaction to the religious right and its promotion of creationism within America's public schools. Third, beginning with about the baby boomers, but gaining steam thereafter, there seems to be a widespread and growing cynicism towards organized religion. One wonders, for example, if Christopher Hitchens' book's subtitle, How Religion Poisons Everything, not just some things or lots of things, but how religion poisons everything, would seem plausible to Americans were it not for their all too vivid awareness of certain televangelists' financial misdealings. Former National Association of Evangelicals President Ted Haggart's troubles concerning drugs and prostitutes, the Catholic Church's most recent sexual abuse scandal, religious organizations' opposition to stem cell research and same-sex marriage, and on and on and on and on. Another factor is likely the end of the Cold War. With the fall of godless communism, expressions of irreligion, while still often stigmatized, no longer smack as thoroughly unpatriotic as they once did. And lastly, the emergence of the internet should be factored in here. Given that atheists have often been a scant, often closeted segment of the population, it would be difficult to overemphasize this as a factor for helping people to consolidate their identities as atheists and to connect with like-minded others. Thanks to the internet, observes David Silverman, the former president of American Atheists, there is no way that a person who's an atheist can think that they're alone anymore. Okay. There are, though, plenty of reasons for them to think that atheists are misunderstood by the majority of their fellow citizens. Okay. And just by way of getting a lay of the land here, let me note that these misunderstandings are, even though they're based on hidebound, commonplace presumptions, they're still dominant today. Let me just mention four presumptions about atheism. The first presumption about atheism is that atheism is simple. Atheism is simple. Okay, so from the Greek a, for without, and theos, for God, atheism refers to any worldview that does not include God or gods. It sounds simple, but if you scratch the surface, you realize, what sounds simple is usually simplified. And that's the case here, okay? In other words, for one thing, the term is negatively defined. We don't have terms like a leprechaunists or a Bigfootist, because most Americans don't believe in little people guarding pots of gold, even in Berkeley, or they don't believe in an ape-like humanoid wandering the woods of the American Northwest. But this isn't true of God, though. The fact that we've naturalized the term atheism and use it so routinely actually denotes more about what's deemed normative within American society than it says anything meaningful about atheists themselves. Okay, so the term atheism says something about what we expect in our society rather than anything meaningful about atheists themselves. So it's also the case that this single term atheism can lead one to think that it's a phenomenon that's simplistic, or it's a single monolithic thing. Whereas in reality, atheism is incredibly variegated. So for instance, while most Americans who identify as atheists became this after some religious socialization as children usually, this is now changing. Now, more and more people are born into secular homes and thus don't need to go to the trouble of becoming atheists at all. It's all they've ever known. But I think last I saw, 11% of Americans were born into non-religious homes, okay? And even for those who do become atheists at some point, the degree of transformation is extremely variable. Some people reject a faith in which they had little investment anyway, whatever. Whereas others may have been once deeply religious and reject that. So that's more of a true conversion in a sense. Next, the distance that people keep from religion, the distance that atheists keep from religion is also varied. For instance, some atheists consider themselves unabashedly secular and perhaps even anti-religious, whereas others may consider them to be spiritual but not religious, and have a live and let live attitude towards religious people and religious institutions and so on. Again, quite variable. And even the level of salience that people's atheism has for their self-identity varies from one person to the next. Whereas for some people, atheism is a central dimension of their identity. Sometimes we call it a master status. So for some atheists, their atheism is a central dimension of their identities, whereas other people just happen to be atheists. The way I happen to have blue eyes, the way I happen to be Sagittarian, it's not a big deal. So my point is, this simple thing, seemingly simple thing, atheism, when you look at it close up, is extremely varied, extremely complex. And that's true of Judaism, Catholicism, and so on and so forth. A second presumption, if I may, is the presumption that atheism is somehow new. Now, I want to be unambiguous about this one. And the fact is, what's new about the new atheism may be its offensively defensive tone or its spate of newly published books and its newfound hearing in the public square, but it is decidedly not new with respect to its atheism, which is probably as old as religion itself. Okay? I can't give a full accounting here. It's above my pay grade right now, but let me just make 3 points about this. One, the intellectual roots of atheism are remarkably deep. In my book on atheism, I trace them to the 5th, 6th century BCE Athens, for example. So it goes way back, okay? Way back to ancient Greek philosophers who endeavored to replace mythological explanations of the world with ones based on publicly accessible rational assessment of facts, okay? Two, that these deep roots of atheism are also very variegated. In other words, when it comes to anchoring religious atheist sensibilities, I see these 4 different roots that appear within 2,500 years ago. The empirical root, the empirical root. In other words, using publicly accessible data to disprove religious claims. The critical root, trying to explain where religion actually comes from, psychological factors, anthropological factors, historical factors. The agnostic route, who's to say? I don't know. I don't know what's true, what's not, and so on. And then the immanent, think about Socrates, the unexamined life isn't worth living, etc. And the immanent route, that you don't need religion. This world gives you enough depth, enough meaning, enough pleasure, enough of all the good things. You don't need something beyond this world. So, and then the third things I would say is those four routes that appeared in Athens 2,500 years ago, those continue to anchor atheist sensibilities today. They still show up when you talk to atheists. Those different ways, those different discourses of thinking about atheist identity still appear. I mean, it's like what William Faulkner once said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. So those atheist roots that allowed atheism to flourish 2,500 years ago are still in play today. We good? Third presumption about atheism. This one's a hard one, so I'm gonna go over this one rather quickly because I'll go. Joel will tell you I can go all day on this one. Fascinating, but lengthy. Anyway, the third presumption about atheism is that atheism is extrinsic. In other words, when I denote that this presumption is false, I'm pointing to the reality that atheism doesn't come from some outside source. It's very much connected to important developments in Western consciousness, and importantly, even to the ongoing project of articulating theism itself. What do I mean by that? Here I'm thinking about the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor and his monumental book called A Secular Age. He puckishly describes theological articulation of ideas about God as the excarnation, not the incarnation, excarnation. By this he means theology in ways of thinking about God and articulating theism have ceased to frame what it means to be religious in terms of a subjective mode, communal bonds, embodied practices, pious dispositions, mystical experiences, a sense of mystery. So we don't think of religion in those ways. The excarnation means we tend to objectify religion through creedal assertions, through dogmas, through intellectual propositions. We, rather than thinking of religion in a very apophatic, internal sensibility about mystery and unknowing and so on, we tend to objectify it, and which is fine. But in objectifying it in propositional truth claims that people are supposed to know and believe, that is what made it more liable to be disconfirmed through the advances of science and so on. So in a way, I always say atheism is kind of, as they say in those Hollywood heist films, kind of an inside job, in the sense that in the West, that we articulate our understandings of God in a very objective vein, allows those objective suppositions and assertions to become discredited by science. Whereas if we thought more in terms of mystery, unknowing, the apophatic, mystical experiences, pious practices, and so on, those things are not susceptible to being undermined by science and so on. So atheism doesn't come from the outside. It comes from steps that we made in the articulation of theology in a very objectified manner, for good or for ill. Fourth, we can talk more about that. Fourth, last one. Proposition number 4, atheism is numerically insignificant. Not really. Globally, and calculated quite conservatively, the number of people who say they don't believe in God or are not religious is somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of a billion worldwide. Now, if that were considered a religious grouping, it would be the fourth largest in the world after Christianity, approximately 2 billion. I'll include Jesuits on that. You're welcome. Islam, 1.2 billion. Hinduism, about 900 million. And then non-belief, okay? Or even in the United States. In the United States, a recent Gallup poll found that 13% of the American public does not believe in God. Now, while only 5% of Americans actually self-identify as atheists, it's worth noting that this 13% figure is hardly minuscule. In other words, it shows that in the United States, the number of non-believers exceeds the number of Mormons, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists combined. Okay, so the 13% of the American citizenry who says they don't believe in God, that's actually a big number. Now, the people who say I'm an atheist, that's only 5%. It's small, but even that's 1 in 20 people. Okay, so not only that, but we have reason to believe that how do I say this? That number, that 13% number and the 5% of atheists probably undercounts both the present and possibly future number of atheists. In other words, for the present, we probably undercount atheists because of what sociologists call the social desirability effect. You know, so pornography is a multi-million-dollar industry, but everybody says no, I don't purchase pornography. There's a naysaying bias. And in the United States, if you say, are you religious or do you believe in God? There is a yay-saying bias. More people probably say that they believe in God than they actually do, because atheism is stigmatized. And as we said, when we said about atheism itself as simplistic, there's a presumption that most people believe in God, okay? So we probably undercount the present number of atheists. And we also have reason to suspect that the future we might have more atheists. In other words, with respect to the future, the rise of the nuns. I don't mean the sensible shoe ruler wielding ones, NONES, no religious preference. The rise of the nuns could likely spell, I bet, the growth of atheism moving forward. By this I mean, after decades of almost no change at all, the number of nuns, people who are non-affiliated with religion, jumped from 7% in 1990 to about 23.5% today. Usually these trends proceed with the rapidity of plate tectonics, very slow. And that was a dramatic and fast shift. Now, it's about 1/2 of the nuns say they believe in God. Okay, so not all of them don't believe in God, but still, this is still important for atheism for 3 reasons. One, their numbers of nuns are growing, especially among younger people. About 40% of younger people under 30 say they have no religious preference. 2, if people distance themselves from religious traditions, they'll over time distance themselves from the ideas and beliefs carried by those religious traditions, belief in God among them. And then 3rd, nuns don't do a particularly robust job in socializing their children into religious belief, practice, and so on. Okay, so there's, I want to say, atheists are not numerically insignificant. We probably undercount their number, and it looks like we have good reason to believe that the numbers will grow in the years and decades ahead. Okay, although we don't use crystal balls in sociology. Okay, but let's go a little deeper now. That's just the lay of the land. And Joel mentioned, and Father Glisson held up my book on atheists. I want to just talk to you about what I learned about atheists by going deeper. Okay. And it's really interesting because this study emerged really quite organically. In other words, a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, some of my whiny, in your face, entitled students, kind of like Joel, would come up to me and say, "What are all these new books on atheism? What's all this atheism stuff? I have Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and so on. We should have a course on atheism." And so, when the students say "we," they mean me. So I thought, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. So I started to teach a class on atheism called, I can't remember, something like atheism, and I can't remember. It was called Atheism in America, something like that. And it was great. We had read good books. We read all the new atheism books. It was fascinating. There were MDiv students. There were people preparing for ministry. There were MA students. There were even a couple of atheists in the class. It was a blast. It was a blast. But at a certain point, this one student, I think it was towards the end of the student, I think I pseudonymously call him Stephen in my book. Stephen's like, this is a really good class. He was kind of a brown noser anyway, so whatever. He's like, this is a really good class. I really love this class. And Stephen self-identified as an atheist, actually. Okay. But he said to me, it's like, where the hell's everybody else though? And I said, what do you mean? He's like, I'm an atheist, but I don't see myself in the pages of these books. I'm not judgmental towards religious people. My parents are religious people. I don't think religious people are stupid. I don't like, he's like, what about everyday atheists like me? And I thought, oh my, son of a gun, he has a good point there. So, and we looked at some books on atheism, but it was based on survey data, survey data is famously broad, but can be very thin. So I was like, wow. Yeah, so I looked around. I didn't see any good books, deep books, capacious, hermeneutically generous books on lived atheism in the United States. So I thought I could do that. So I started to go to all these atheist groups and atheist meetups and atheist lectures. But guess what? The thing I was struck by, I kept seeing the same people over and over and over again. And the best thing was when the light bulb went on, when I went into the San Francisco's iconic Roxy Theater, and there was an atheist film festival. And I saw 6 of the 7 films that day. I didn't see the one on Charles Darwin. I already know about Charles Darwin. But anyway, and the thing is, there was one documentary called Meet an Atheist. And it was a good documentary. It was all about demystifying and debunking a lot of stereotypes about atheists. Hello, I'm an atheist. I'm a nice person. I don't want to kill your cat. Stuff like that. But I was struck. About 2/3 of the people in the documentary were actually in the audience. And I was like, geez, the gene pool isn't exactly Olympic size here. It's like the same people over and over again. And I realized, hey, most atheists are not members of these groups. They're living their lives. They're gardening. They're accountants. They're mothers. They're brothers. They're just living their lives. And so all the studies that we read in that class on atheists were not very good studies because they were just looking at the tip of the iceberg. It's like going to the Vatican and doing a study of Catholics. They're not very representative of Catholics generally, right? You get my point. So I thought, okay, I got it. I'm going to do a study of everyday atheists, not people who write books or go to all these meetup groups, all this, but just everyday atheists. Because I realized everyday atheists are different from the dyed-in-the-wool, book writing, polemical atheists. So I started. And I started by inviting people to participate in my study, just getting on Berkeley Parents Network or getting on Facebook and all this kind of stuff. And I'll cut to the chase. But I ended up interviewing, I think it was 518 atheists. I surveyed them. I interviewed most of them either in person or on the phone or online and so on. So that's a lot. And it was like, I think it was something like 8,000 pages of single space interview transcripts and surveys and all that kind of stuff. So, because I wanted to actually find out what's going on. I didn't want to just study the tip of the iceberg and draw conclusions about the rest, okay? And I found out just a number of insights I want to share with you that I think will be kind of germane and kind of demystifying and debunking stereotypes as you think about your own connection to Berkeley and evangelizing and so on, okay? One insight is, guess what? This was really obvious. I should publish it in Duh magazine, but anyway, the insight is everyday lived atheism is very different from the official atheism that you get in these new atheist books, okay? Just the way that everyday Catholics are not like, you know, people that work in the Vatican. Only about half of them work anyway. Anyway, all right. There's a reason why it's called the Protestant work ethic, is what I'm saying. Anyway, so lived atheism is different from official atheism, okay? So for example, it was amazing how many people I interviewed would say, I don't know. You know, I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, you know? And they weren't like the new atheist writers who seem to know everything. They're like, I don't know all the answers, you know? I just happen to be non-religious. I can't tell somebody else who happens to be religious that he's got it wrong or she's got it wrong, you know, and so on. So there's that. They also resisted scientism. Scientism is a term we use in philosophy. Sometimes it just means scientific knowledge is the only legitimate, worthwhile knowledge. No, I mean, you could argue that the new atheist writers were they really embraced scientism. If you can't measure it, it doesn't. But these everyday atheists, no, they talked about meaning all the time. This is meaningful to me in a personal sense. I'm not saying it's meaningful for you or has to be meaningful for you, but it's meaningful to me. It was amazing that these atheists, they believe in a lot. I want to be a good dad. Why? I want to be a good citizen. Why? I want to be generous. Why? I want to give back to the community. These were not Friedrich Nietzsche. These were not nihilists. They believed in a lot of things. They were, as sociologist Christian Smith famously puts it, they are homo credens, beings who believe in certain things. Now, they might not believe in a transcendent, but they believe in strong cultural scripts about being a good dad, about being a good citizen, about giving back to the community. They believe in a lot. Also, about a third of them call themselves spiritual, but they always follow the if this, then yes pattern. So they say, if by spiritual you mean I feel a sense of awe when I'm out in nature, or a sense of beauty when I listen to a symphony, or feelings of profound gratitude when my daughter was born. If by that, if that's spiritual, then I'm spiritual. Or I feel deep connection to my fellow human beings. If that's spiritual, then I'm spiritual. And also, they were less critical of religion than the new atheists, than official atheism. In fact, so much so, I had to change the title of my book. It was The Varieties of Irreligious Experience, but I realized most of my everyday atheists were not irreligious at all. In other words, anti-religious. I did not like religious people. They just happened to be non-religious. So I actually changed the title because of this. And for example, they're less critical of God or people's belief in God. It's like, I get it. I don't believe in God, but I get that why someone would, like, you're not a dummy. But they were more critical of certain images of God that they thought led to certain bad behaviors. Like a judgmental God led to judgmentalism. God as Father could often lead to paternalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so they were less critical about God than they were about certain images of God that they thought were precipitous of certain bad behaviors. Two, they were less critical of religiosity than they were of objectified religions. In other words, less critical about religiosity. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not religious, but I can see how a person in the 21st century would be religious, and so on. For example, well, anyway, but they were more critical of religious packages, as we discussed earlier, objectified religious things that you had to believe in, orthodoxy, right belief, and so on and so forth, okay? And lastly, they were less critical of religious people than they were of religious institutions that they talked about as being too dogmatic, hypocritical, and so on. In fact, they were not critical of religious people generally. About half the people that I interviewed who were married to religious people. Not a problem. I'm atheist, he's religious, fine, and so on. I'm an atheist, she's religious, fine. I wish she'd learn how to drive, but anyway, but she's religious, that's fine. You get the idea. Second insight, an imagined community of fellow atheists is more important than actual ones. Among religious groupings in the United States, US atheists are the least likely to say that belonging to a community of like-minded others is important to them. Only 22% of atheists say, oh, no, I would like to belong to an atheist community. The others, no problem. I don't want to belong. But they all sort of existed where we can call like an imagined community. They saw themselves as having a lot in common with people who happen to be non-believers. And I would say there are two reasons for that. One, atheists are because we conflate religiosity with ethics, atheists are considered immoral, less moral, less ethical. They're considered by the immoral other, okay? Now that's not true. There's actually zero data that says that atheists are less moral than religious people. They might be differently moral. They might be, what's moral? How do you define that? But there's zero data that suggests that atheists are less ethical than religious people. Now, you yourself could say, oh, I personally would be less ethical, and so on and so on. But there's zero data. But things taken to be true are true in their effects. So atheists feel stigmatized. They all have stories of rejection, incivilities, difficulties, and so on. So they all have that common bond of experiencing some level of stigma. Second, because in this country, we counterpoise religion and science, belief and knowledge, faith and fact. We even call this the conflict myth. We think that science is at loggerheads with religion, which actually it isn't. Actually, there is no such thing as science. There are sciences, and there's no thing called religion. There are religions, and so on and so forth. And so there's also zero evidence, in other words, that religious people are somehow dumber or less rational than atheists. Also zero evidence. But religious people, atheists, tend to think of themselves as being in community with other atheists, even though they're not physically in community with them, because they have a shared experience about being treated as the immoral other and seeing religious people as the irrational other. Now, in sociology, we have a very famous expression. It's called the Thomas theorem, named after the great W.I. Thomas. Nobody reads them anymore. But anyway, he has this line. He says, things taken to be true are true in their effects. Now, it's not true that religious people are less ethical, and it's not true it's not true that atheists are less ethical, and it's not true that religious people are less rational, but things taken to be true are real in their effects, and so they keep atheists and religious people from having conversations. What's the point? He's immoral. What's the point? She's irrational. Why talk? Why have these deeper conversations and so on? That's a shame. Third insight. Everybody knows that atheists have a disproportionate educational attainment. Atheists tend to be very well educated in this country. Atheists tend to kind of be right-brained, very cognitive. Study after study after study has shown that. But I was struck, I'm trying to look struck, though, pedagogical effect, struck by the use of emotion language, feeling language. It was fascinating. I could talk about this all day, but I'm gonna be quick. Think about it. Religious people, how do religious people know that they're on the right track as religious people? They have doctrines, they have sacraments, they have rituals, they have creedal affirmations, they have distinctive practices. How do atheists know that they're on the right track? As atheists, as good atheists, what they did was they elicited and deployed their emotions to signal that they're on the right track. They felt regret for when they were religious. They felt free now that they were atheists. And they feel responsible for carving out their own futures on their own terms. So interesting, all these survey-based studies of atheists never saw that. But talking to these folks, the use of affective language to signal that they're on the right track, they feel on the right track as a good atheist, was as subtle as a punch in the gut. It really was. It was amazing. Last one, and the hardest one. I would say truly understanding atheists means seeing them in less negative terms. In other words, in sociology, we have a term inherited from Max Weber, the great sociologist, called Verstehen. Now, as you know, many of you, Verstehen is the German word that means understanding. But in sociology, we mean a deep, empathetic understanding of the other on the other's own terms. So when I look at, say, Kristen, I don't say, oh, she's a lousy sociologist, husband and father. No, I'd be judging her on the basis of my categories. We do it all the time. I'd be projecting my categories onto her rather than understanding the other on the basis of her categories, what's important to her in all her beautiful otherness, okay? The opposite of good sociology is not crap. The opposite of good sociology is autobiography, projecting your own normative categories onto other people. And so we need to stop doing that with atheists. So we see them in terms of rejection, abandoning religion, negation, not believing, absence, without faith. But actually, rather than seeing them as rejecting things that are important to you, they're actually trying to embrace something else. Integrity, open-mindedness, progress, responsibility. Those themes emerge again and again and again. I mean, if you were looking, non-combatants just don't sit around not waging war. The unemployed just don't sit around not working gainfully. And the same is true of the atheist. The atheist is not just rejecting things that you believe in. The atheist is embracing something else with a desire for integrity, meaning, and so on. That's where you have a lot in common. That's where you, the people I'm looking at right now, have a lot in common with those folks. Let me wrap up. So I think that it's too bad that it's easy to write off the new atheists because they're so dogmatic and so on. But it's too bad that everyday atheists get written off like they're guilty by association. Whereas everyday atheists, if you approach them with the spirit of Verstehen, understanding them on their own terms, and when you cast them in a non-stereotypical light, when you acknowledge their valid critiques of religion oftentimes, when you see them as gravitating towards lives of fullness and in a positive way, then you realize that they have a lot to say to us, that they have a lot to say to believers, Catholics included, okay? They're not just an absence that needs to be filled. There's something there, okay? And so as Catholics, when you think about evangelization, thank you for that summary, by the way, Joel, that was really helpful. When you think about evangelization, it's not always about better music, although that's fine, or better homilies, get on that, Father, please. Or it's not always about community, or it's not always about the vicissitudes of church politics and all that kind of stuff, okay? People don't care how many angels dance on the head of a pin. I would say that atheists are, as one of my students said, a real blessing because they're very vocal. I'm saying it slowly because I want this to come through. They're very vocal about grappling with some of the big issues that other Americans, Catholics included, also grapple with. Catholics don't grapple with the number of angels on the head of a pin. Catholics don't grapple with a lot of church politics things. Catholics don't grapple with whether or not Father Gliston's going to nail it this Sunday in the homily or not. Catholics, like atheists, grapple with some of the big questions presented to us by modernity. Let me just mention three and I'll quit. One, a feature of modernity that's important is what some scholars call a rationalization of consciousness. I'm wrapping up. Just give me a few more minutes if you don't mind. In other words, this is the emergence of an instrumental, pragmatic, techno-analytical style of thinking that seems at odds with expressive, pious, mystery, attentive ways of thinking. So rationalization of consciousness means a style of thinking has emerged that seems inimical to religious ways of thinking. And we know that why that's the case. High-tech jobs, kind of a neoliberal capitalism that requires planning and efficiency and credentialism. We all have to think in that very pragmatic way. So what happens? What happens is religious ways of thinking, by comparison, are often written off as less serious. Okay? Or as only reducible, like, who cares what the church says? It's all about just being a good person. Think about it. Many of us have taught high school, right? I used to teach theology at high school. In the high school, the kids had a big Northern Anthology of English Literature book, a big trigonometry book. I had no idea what the hell was in it. A big history book. And here's their theology textbook. This little, mostly word jumble, dot to dot, be nice, and so on. So we teach kids from the get-go that to be an adult requires an adult understanding of English literature, trigonometry, and history, but a child's understanding of religion and faith. And so we just say, okay, religion is just being a good person. The problem with that is there are a lot of ways of being a good person. Goodness flows from many cultural wells. You can be a good person as a Catholic, for sure, but you can be a good person as a socialist, a good person as a medical doctor, a good person as a communist, a good person as whatever, a hippie, and so on. There are a lot of ways of being a good person. So it begs the question, first big question. So if simple goodness flows from many wells, the question is, what's the value of a distinctly religious tradition, given that there are other ways of seeing the world and other ways of being a good person? Think about it. That's a question that atheists are actually asking. And that's a question that you should be asking. And we don't know. It's hard. It's a hard one. It's a tough one. It requires a deeper conversation. I would say prayerful conversation. It's not just a philosophical question. That's a big, it's not like, oh, should we arrange our pews this way or that way? That's not the question. That's a big question. A second feature of modernity is what we call, sorry about the terms, Sorry about these weird philosophical terms, but we call it a pluralization of life worlds. That just means that we're much more aware of myriad ways of viewing the world with no obvious metric for adjudicating the superiority of one worldview over another worldview. Okay? This is relatively new. In other words, we have more cognitive access to different ways of being in the world. I think about my grandparents or my parents. They lived in South Boston. You know, it was pretty like all they knew was Irish Catholics, Irish Catholics, Irish Catholics. There'd be an occasional Italian Catholic, you know, crazy. But now we're much more aware of religious alterity. We know about Buddhism. We know about Hinduism. We know about Islam. We know about all these different. We have more cognitive access to religious difference, to religious pluralism. Okay, now that doesn't mean that we're heteroglossic, that we can speak knowledgeably about those things, but we're heteronostic, that they're on our radar screens. We know about them. Okay, and that's true of Catholics too. We're more likely to say, my parents and grandparents used to say, this is true. Now more and more Catholics say, this is true for me. Just like atheists, more and more atheists say, this is true for me. For me, what does that mean? It means you don't want to hubristically overestimate your own sense of truth or judgmentally underestimate somebody else's, you know? And it's amazing. It's quite fragilizing, but it raises a question. And here's the other question that atheists are very vocal about, but I actually think it implicates Catholics as well. The question is, not what's the value of a distinctly religious tradition, but in this case, what's the value of a particular religious tradition among others? That's a hard one. No more angels dancing on the head of the pin. No more what color vestments should we be wearing, although that is important in certain seasons. That's a big issue. You don't know the answer to that issue, I don't think. I don't know the answer to that issue, I don't think. Atheists are pushing that. That's a deeper conversation. Last one. A third aspect of modernity is, you know, it's this, again, sorry for the philosophical language, the subjectivization of truth claims. In other words, for good or for ill, the locus of religious authority is in the self. We've moved from what Immanuel Kant called heteronymous authority, outside authority, texts, religious authority, traditions, to autonomy, autonomous authority, the self, for good or for ill. In other words, you know, if on the macro level, more religious ideas are cognitively available to people, on the micro level, the self level, for good or for ill, people choose, they appropriate certain dimensions of traditions and pass on others, depending on the kind of lives that they're living and what's important to them. Okay, some people might take feminist theology, Catholic social teaching, and maybe pass on all the stuff. Somebody else might take Mass and Latin, ritualism, etc., pass on something else for good or for ill. Okay, people are doing that. And even the language of think about the language, how the language of self frames our religious identities today. So many people talk about authenticity. Why are people talking about authenticity? Because it must mean because there are more and multiple ways of being a person. It's hard to know whether you've chosen correctly. The term identity crisis was only coined in 1965. My parents didn't have an identity crisis. You didn't go to college. You got to do what your dad did. You know, it's and so on. You don't have an identity crisis if you don't have choice. Now the language of authenticity is so important because we do have choices and we have less robust ways of ascertaining whether our choices are the right ones or not. Or even the distrust of institutions or the language of spirituality. Oh, spirituality about experience and feeling and selfhood, whereas religion is about institutions and guys with robes, et cetera, no offense, and so on. Or even the language of seeking. Where I compare my mom to my sister. Obviously, only a one generation difference. My mom, are you a good Catholic? She goes, yeah, I'm a good Catholic. So I'll prove it, lady. Well, she's no lady, but she'd say, I'm firm, I'm steadfast, I'm convicted. Notice the stasis language. If you ask my sister Maureen, are you a good Catholic? She'd say, yes, prove it. I seek, I search, I question. Notice that the seeking language, the movement language, which is better. No, those are two distinctive framings for two distinctive types of lives. And so my point is that the locus of religious authority is in the self for ways that can be problematic, but also quite precipitous of authenticity and goodness and so on. But it raises a question, last question. Raises a question, not what's the value of a distinctly religious tradition or a particular religious tradition, but what's the value of an authoritative religious tradition if everybody gets to make up their own version of it? What's my point? Last thing, I don't know the answer to these questions. The great philosopher Hegel has this great line, the owl of Minerva spreads her wings and flies at dusk. In other words, Minerva was the goddess of knowledge. We only know later on. We don't know the answer to some of these questions. Not because we're stupid or we're not trying hard enough, but sometimes the times have a vote. We can only see so much at a given time. But these are profoundly religious questions. But guess what? They're profoundly religious questions that atheists are asking. And that's a bind. That's what you have in common. And I would say that if we think about those religious questions as serious questions and invite other people to engage with us, then we'll have more honest conversation about faith and doubt, belief and non-belief, sacred and profane and so on. That's a better conversation, okay? I titled my book, The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience, after one of my heroes, William James, who wrote the famous Varieties of Religious Experience. I did that because of the focus on feelings and so on. But I love at the end of that book, James is talking about a certain kind of life. And it's a life that quote, seeks the feeling of being in a wider life than of this world's selfish little interests. That was his definition of the saint. And I would say, from talking to all these atheists and all the Catholics I spoke to in my earlier book, I would say that's a pretty good definition of the Catholics I spoke to and the atheists I spoke to. And I think that's not a conversation stopper. I think it's a conversation starter. And I applaud you for, rather than doing the usual thing, wagging your finger at non-believers, getting some weird sociologist like me to try to help you to do the good work that you want to do and can do by saying, let's reframe the atheists and realize we have conversation partners for sure. And they're waiting to hear from you. So thanks for listening. I might have gone over a little bit, but what can I say? Okay, we can open up the conversation. I think Joel is going to be facilitating, or I can, whatever you want to do, I'm happy to do.
Oh, thank you, Professor Baggett. So like I told you, I'm sure it was entertaining. So just imagine that for 2 hours more, our classes at JST go for
it's like the afterlife. If you go to hell, that is.
So
Joel, can I just suggest a possibility here for questions and answers right now? That people place their questions in the chat, and then we will unmute you to actually have a discussion on them. Will that work? Because it strikes me that there's an awful lot here that's worth more to be in a dialogue than just answering a question. Does that make sense? Is that okay with you guys, Nora and Kat?
We'll give it a go.
Okay, and it is 11:30 right now, so we're going to limit this till 12 noon. Does that sound okay, or do we need to cut it shorter than that? Don't everybody speak at once.
I think 12 noon will be all right because we're scheduled to come back at 1:30.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay. All right. So if you have questions that you want to put in the chat, I have 3 pages of notes here. So I'm going to try to avoid being the one talking for the most part and open it up to the congregation.
We have our first question though from Laura. And so, where are you, Laura? Let me look for you here so I can unmute
Or it's
you.
actually in France right now. So
Oh, on the Zoom, where are you? Where are you? Oh, great. So if you can ask your question. Oh, great. Just unmute. I think okay, perfect.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I tremendously enjoyed your talk. We're supposed to call you not Professor Baggett, but Professor Jerome.
They call me a lot of things, trust me.
And on that same vein, by the way, we never call our pastor Father Glisson. He's Father Nick to us, so by his own choice. So I have a very close friend who is a dedicated atheist. Her parents were atheist. She grew up Jewish, secular Jew in Manhattan, and she's my only American friend here in Paris. We've been friends for over 20 years, and she wants me to read the Christopher Hitchens book as an act of friendship. And is there a book that I could share with her, because I feel like she wants to believe in God. She feels so lonely. I sense her grasping for something higher, but she can't allow herself to believe in God because she feels she'll be betraying her intellectual roots.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, well, one, read that book. I don't think it was a great book, but Christopher Hitchens is a very good writer. And you would do that, I think, probably, it sounds like you're on board with this, out of respect for her and out of respect for your friendship. So of course, also, when she talks about not wanting to leave this tradition, the secular tradition, she sounds a lot like, religious people who might have doubts, but they stay in their religious traditions, because religious traditions aren't just about these ideas. They're about this chain of memory. It's about the past. It's about family. It's about ethnic identity and so on. So when people leave a religion or when people leave a secular identity, that's to be respected, because those people are thinking about something, and rather than just kind of going with it, they're trying something new. So I respect everybody who's really trying to push themselves and think about a new way of being, or trying to be honest with themselves if something works or not. So all that I think deserves respect. But a book I like quite a bit, and that she might read, Father Nick held up my book, but please.
Shameless promotion.
Get it, get it used on Amazon. I'm sure they'll. But anyway, a book I kind of like quite a bit, and I'm mentioning it because I know my students liked it quite a bit. Karen Armstrong is a British religious studies scholar, and she has a book called A Case for God. It's not really an in-your-face case. It's a poorly titled book. It's not really an in-your-face case for God, but what she's saying is something I kind of said a little bit earlier. It's like, this is a great conversation. We should be having a conversation about faith and doubt and belief and non-belief and what's true and what's false. We should be doing that. But she said it's a shame that these new atheist books are just not very good books.
Yeah. Well, I'm just to jump in.
Yeah.
My only fear is if it's anything like everything else I've read by Karen Armstrong, it has the density of cesium-254. I mean, it is so, it's wonderful writing, but most of what I've read by her is pretty dense. So I'm thinking of something less I recommend your book, but I haven't read the whole thing yet. So
Yeah, all right. Well, that's a good book, but if she, okay, but probably Nick's point is well taken. Maybe one that would be a little bit more user-friendly for someone who doesn't have a lot of maybe philosophical background or theological background. Might be, this was years ago since I did the reading for this book, by the way, but Alistair McGrath is also a British, he's a British theologian, and he has a book called Why God Won't Go Away.
oh, good book.
It was really interesting because he's so honest. I think he had been an atheist, and he's like, I like being an atheist. It was good, and I had integrity, but like, okay, but the natural paradigm that I was living was, it didn't fully encapsulate my whole being. There was something that Marx and Freud and Nietzsche weren't helping me to grapple with. There was something else in me that wasn't being accounted for by the natural paradigm. So he was very honest, and so that would be a really good book, I think. But I think the best is just your honest conversation with her, because we attend to each other, not necessarily to be politically correct or to be nice, but we need each other because we all live just a single thin sliver of what it means to be human. So I talk to other people, not because I'm necessarily a nice guy or whatever, but I need to be aware of other people's experience to round out my own and have a fuller notion of what it means to be human. So I think the best text is just your friendship with this person and hers with you.
Thank you very much. I think Georgianne Perkins has a question before mine.
Yeah, can you unmute Georgianne, Jerome or Jerome?
Got it. Thanks so much. I wonder what it is that atheists use to justify their goodness, integrity, and positive attributes and goals and aspirations, when if it's just based on what I believe, and there's no broader, bigger power, God, that gives us those values, that loves us and and shares with us that that's the right way to be. And what I worry about is that this current generation of atheists who seek to be good or still have that religious background in there somewhere that's helping them to maintain those values. But a generation or two from now, when it's all about me, it won't matter anymore if I'm good or bad, if I give food to the hungry or kick them in the street, because it's my decision. So anyway, if you could kind of address that a bit. Thank you.
Well, yeah, no, thank you, Georgianne. Those are good questions. All right, let me think for a second. You are absolutely correct. So a lot of people miss this, but a lot of our kind of ethical discourse that we use in the public square that's quite secular has religious genealogy, like rights language. Well, show me a right, show me a right. There's a person who didn't have a right to vote if she lived, in the 1920s. There's another person who didn't have a right for certain things, certain public facilities and so on. So rights don't exist, but the idea of rights has deep religious roots. For example, the idea of goodness and beauty, oftentimes those things have real deep religious genealogies. So that's absolutely the case. There's no doubt about that. The other thing is, you're right. What do religious folks rely on? They rely on what Charles Taylor calls the modern moral order, these cultural scripts that are not religious, but do ethical work for people. Like, you can be non-religious and consider, be a humanist, for example, or be a social justice advocate and so on. I think there are non-transcendent cultural scripts, narratives, and so on that do a good job anchoring people's ethical sensibilities. Don't take my word for it. use your eyes and ears. And if you do that, you see, oh, okay, there is a non-believer, but is behaving quite ethically, and so on. So it does seem to be doing the work. But now your other important point. Oh, and by the way, a lot of atheists had trouble believing that, understanding that, because I'd say, listen, I think you are an ethical person. I'm thinking about an interview I did. It went this way. Well, we're talking about ethics. And I do think you're a good dad. I do think you're a good husband. I do think you're a good citizen. But how do you know you're those things? And you'd be like, well, okay, because they're the values of my society. I said, okay, good, that's right. And you're doing a good job. But what if you lived in the 1930s or Nazi Germany, for example? Would you just be goose stepping down Main Street and say, I'm just abiding by the, and he's like, well, that's a hard one. If society changes, maybe my values would change. But I actually think that's true of all of us in a way, even religious people. I think there's still overlap there. Your last point about the future. I don't know the future because you're kind of like projecting, like, okay, if this is where we are now, 2 generations from now, we'll be there, right? But who knows? Oftentimes, maybe through the kind of conversation that I'm advocating, we have a deeper conversation about meaning, goodness, transcendence, and so on, that goes beyond the kind of platitudes that we often use. And it could be like another kind of great awakening that might be religious, might be secular, might be an amalgam of both. I just think since Socrates, we thought we're going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, that's, Socrates was one of the reasons why he was put to death, corrupting the youth, which is what all professors do on a good day. But we always think things are going to hell in a handbasket. We always think things are going downhill. And yet somehow we're able to engender and percolate new categories for meaningful, generative, decent lives together. So there are always these pendulum swings. Maybe you're right. Maybe society does become more callous, individualistic, less caring, and so on. And what happens when that is the case? Oftentimes people see it as such and move it in another direction. But only time will tell that.
Something, in the middle of the 19th century, right after the French Revolution, everybody in France thought that they were going to go marching strongly into a secularist society, and religion was on the way out, and that would be that. And it clearly did not go that way. I mean, they did have their contribution, but I mean, if you can make a case for the 20th century being the most religious century in history, for good and for very bad. So we don't know what the future is. I'm just going to piggyback onto something, because I was going to bring this up later in the thing, but this is another book I'm reading. It was given to me by a parishioner. It's called The Good Life Method. I don't like the title of it, but I really like the book. And basically it's the Megan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko, who are professors at the University of Notre Dame, and they teach the Philosophy 101 course. And this is basically an overview of that course. Advocating what they call virtue ethics versus sophistry, which is basically just coming up with an argument to prove you're right. And my sense is that this is the sort of thing that sort of directs us, religious or not, toward a better understanding of who we are. And this is another shameless promotion here. Next February 26th, and will be an in-person gathering here at the church. We're doing a symposium called "Is There Heaven?" And the reason, or is heaven real? The reason we chose that title was it's clickbait, basically, to get you to be interested in it. But it's really a understanding of the influence of classical philosophy on religious teaching, and it goes down to the current day. And I think it's a very helpful thing. And Sullivan and Blaschko are in this book are kind of proving the point that there's an awful lot that's gone on before us that shapes where we are now. And for that, I'll shut up.
No, that's great.
So,
Thank you very much. And I believe Kristen is next. You're unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Well, it's posted there, and I was pondering perhaps the link, or wondering if our speaker sees a link between the increase of atheism as somewhat linked to the rise of fundamentalism in all religions. And I offered a personal comment that sometimes it's hard to hold on to faith when you see what is being done in the name of religion. But then I wanted to just say the 3 questions that you say atheists are asking are certainly questions that religious people should be asking, and do ask, I guess. What is the value of one tradition versus another? But I kind of wanted to just focus on the increase in atheism and whether you think it does link to that, or if there's no evidence. So I'll stop.
Well, no, I think, all right, remember I talked about the nuns? The nuns, it seems apparent that the people who became nuns when they did, it was a kind of a pushback. It was a resistance against the rise of the religious right in politics.
Okay.
And somebody like, if that's religion, I don't want to be it. So that seems, that is an empirical, bright finding. So I would say yes. I think there are fundamentalists on both sides. There are religious fundamentalists who do not represent religion quite well, and they're an easy target for atheists, and something to push back against. And I would also argue that there are kind of enlightenment fundamentalists within atheism. I would say a lot of the new atheist writers were kind of like, whoa. I mean, even Dante said reason has small wings, so I think there's kind of an enlightenment fundamentalism that goes on both sides, where people don't say, like, I don't know, you could say that. But I'm going to push it this way. I actually think one way of thinking, I just try to call balls and strikes. I just try to present the best way I possibly can. But if I can just take that hat off for a second, I'm going to quote one of my students at the end of that class. He said, I think the rise of atheism is a real blessing. And think about it. I think atheists are kind of critiquing religious traditions, religious institutions, religious people sometimes in ways that they might need to be critiqued. I critique my 16-year-old son. Why? Because I love him. Because, because I want better, So I actually think atheists are holding up a mirror to religious people. I also think that atheists. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I think atheists are leading the way in asking those 3 questions that we're all implicated by. And so rather than just silly things or superficial things, if together religious people, atheists, could really address those deeper things and divest oneself of one's knowing and say, I don't know. And maybe I'm scared. And maybe I'm walking by faith. I actually think the worst thing would be to write each other off. Oh, atheist, immoral. Oh, religious people, irrational. But to actually practice verstehen on both sides, understand the other on the other's own terms, and understand that both groups are really grappling with important things that should be grappled with. Religion is too important to be simple. Religion is too important to be easy. We live in a time now where it makes, in my opinion, we live in a time now, if you just think about these questions, think about our world, it makes perfect sense to me that someone would claim an atheist identity. It makes absolute, utter sense to me. It also makes absolute, utter sense to me that someone would claim a religious identity. That makes perfect sense to me. And so that's actually an important time, a summoning time, like, oh, we can meet at these questions, we can meet at our unknowing. And guess what? I would also say we can meet in our belief, because there are no non-believers. We all believe in something. We are all homo credens. The atheists I interviewed believed in a lot of stuff. I always say, Religion is cultural, and culture is religious, because we believe in these scripts, we believe in these ideas, we believe in these values, we believe in these norms all the time. We created this line, believers, non-believers, but that line is keeping us from seeing something real, and that is they have more in common than we know. And that's a richer conversation than going into your corners, into your separate echo chambers, is what I would say. You could argue that this is a great time religiously. I think about a lot of religious people I know. I think about my family. They're very religious, but in a very childlike way.
Mhm.
Fine, it's
Big
fine.
issue for me.
It's fine. I'm very childlike in when it comes to the laws of thermodynamics. I'm very I don't know how to get my car to work. I don't know how to fix my car, and so on. But I actually think this moment is a time when we can have a deeper, more meaningful, I would say vulnerable conversation about faith and mystery, religion and doubt, and divest ourselves of our presumptions of that we know everything. You know, I do that with my students, or I try to. I have a lot of cultural capital, and if they just listen to every word I say and write it down in their stupid little notebooks, that puffs me up. I feel good. But if I say, screw the Professor Baggett thing, let's read the text together. What do you think? Then I'm not in the student building business, I'm in the colleague building business. And so when we ask these deeper questions and we let go of our authority, we let go of our presumptions of knowing and are vulnerable, that's where conversation happens, real conversation.
We have time for just one short question more, and I'm going to let Joel pick it.
Well, Kathleen had asked before Jojo. So Kathleen, if you ask yours, I just asked you to unmute. Should pop up there now asking you to unmute. Good, perfect.
Katie.
I really have enjoyed your words about atheists because it's demystified some things that I've had. But I'm wondering if we should be more worried about religious fundamentalism than we should be about atheists. I often read writers who say, "Oh, Katie, you know, I'm not religious, but," and then they put a lot out there for me to discuss with them, whether it's the pending death of a loved one, whether it's crime prevention, social justice, etc. And so when they say I'm not religious or I'm an atheist, then I have to frame it in a certain way. And maybe this helps, your lecture helps me reframe them in a different manner. But I think fundamentalism is a greater danger to us than the threat of quote unquote atheism.
I would agree.
Yeah, but you know, no, I hear you, Catalina. I would. Here's what I think. I don't use worry language. I don't use danger language, right? You know, to quote Maud from Harold and Maude, you know, humans are my favorite species. You know, I mean, just the mess we are, like we're so searching and we're so empty and we're so unknowing, we're so full of shit. So like, really, we're such a mess. I don't worry, I don't feel danger. I just kind of feel affection and empathy and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't worry about fundamentalists. I wouldn't worry about atheists and so on. I think the best thing that you can do is not lead with your answers or lead with judgments and so on. Lead with your example, you know? And if this is a place where people worry less about people or feel endangered less about people, but are actually engaging those questions in a deep way, in a summoning way, in an epistemologically humble way, people are going to come. People are going to come. There's a famous philosopher from Princeton who wrote this great book I love called On Bullshit. And he, it was fascinating. It's like, why is there so much bullshit in our society? I mean, no, it's a wonderful, it's a good question. And there is, online, everything is about a nanosecond. You're not expected to go slow and think deeply and so on. But there's still a hunger for that. If you are you, lead with your witness. Lead with the poverty of your knowing. Lead with your vulnerability. And people are going to see that, because that seems like a non-bullshit posture in a society rife with bullshit. There'll always be a taste, there'll always be a segment that wants the bullshit, but you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised when I know, I'll quit here. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in my lifetime. And when I see a person or know a person, I always know what they're thinking. Oh, he's thinking that, she's thinking that. He feels this way, she values that. And I'm not really a quantitative sociologist, so let me see if I can do this. I've been wrong 100% of the time. When you actually enter in this conversation, now you know this because you're counseling, you'll be surprised every time. Everybody seems superficial because you only have granular access to your depth. You think, oh, I'm profound. Guess what? Everybody else is too. And I would say if you're open to people's otherness and you just signal that, people are going to be drawn to that because it doesn't exist elsewhere. He's a client, she's a customer, he's that type of person, she's that type of person. And if you want to go deeper with people, there are people who are ready for that, and at least feel that that's missing in their lives.
Great. Well, it's just a minute before 12. So thank you very much, Professor Baggett. I think 2 more questions in the chat, and I'm sure we could go on for another hour easily. So definitely, I think some type of follow-up will be needed because we're now beginning to, I think, demystify atheists and atheism. So just to say thank you.
In the second half of the conference today, we're going to be looking at, how do we evangelize? And for what Jerome's given us this morning, I think it gives us a direction that is going to be very helpful for specifically dealing with this neighborhood and our quote clientele, unquote. And so that's my hope, is some of these questions might get raised again this afternoon in terms of how do we implement an engagement with the community around us. And with that, I'm going to go to Barney's and have a hamburger.
So
He meant veggie burger.
I want red meat.
Oh, God.
thank you so much,
Terrific.
Jerome. We're actually going to disconnect the call. We're not trying to, there was some little static going on in there. So we want to see if we can figure that out. When you come back in, yes, there'll be a waiting room again, but we do plan to start up again at 1:30. Thank you everyone for being here today. This has been fabulous. Thank you again, Jerome. It was awesome.
Thank you very much.
It was literally my pleasure.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for showing up. Nice people.